So SERUM 2, it has arrived. And oh man, has it arrived. Now before this, I obviously, like many of you, had extremely high hopes. And as is normal when you have high hopes, it's often the case that you're disappointed. Well, that couldn't be further from the truth. It has absolutely demolished any expectations that I had of this. I am blown away. And the problem, if I can call it that, is that there is so much to feature. There is so much to show that I can only barely touch the surface. So that's what this video will be. It will just be a very quick introduction to, I'm going to caveat with saying some of the features because I'm no doubt going to miss loads of them. I was playing with it last night and everywhere I click, there's something new and exciting to investigate. So let's start with a general overview. So we have the basic layout, and I'm going to say this looks quite familiar. If you're familiar with SERUM 1, you'll pick this up and everything is where it should be. Everything is where you expect it to be. So I think they've done a fantastic job incorporating the new features while retaining the look and feel of SERUM 1. So that's on the main oscillator page here. We now have a mix tab. So here we have a quick way to mix all the oscillators and do panning and center the FX buses, which I'll cover in just a moment. You'll see to the right of that, oscillator C. You'll also see filter 2, just a bit of hint of what's to come soon. And then we have two FX buses to the right of that, which then can have their outputs directed, well, directly or to bus 2, and then so on and so forth. So really quite a lot of flexibility that this mix tab provides. Then we have the FX page, and I think this is one of, well, it's hard to say, I was about to say one of the biggest additions, but everywhere is a big addition. So here we have some of the classic effects that you're used to. In fact, all of them are obviously retained because this is fully backwards compatible with SERUM 1. So if we bring up, for example, the EQ, this is exactly the same as you'd find in version 1, but the benefit is you can now add an extra one. And this, while we're on the subject, is my only criticism, and I can't even call it that, but I would quite like to have a new EQ that has more than 2 bands. And even that's a non-issue because you can just stack up as many of these as you want and then draw in as many bands as you want. In here, we have a couple new effects. We have the bowed frequency shifter, which is one of my favorite effects generally, and now having this in SERUM is just awesome. And then the other additional one is a convolution reverb. In addition to these new effects, we now have, let me just delete these to make more room just to demonstrate. In addition to those new effects, we now have 4 utility devices, 3 of which are splitters. So here, this is low and high. So if we load this in, we can now split the incoming signal into bands. So if we want on the lows, we can put, let's say, just a delay just on the lows if we want. And then on the highs, let's put just the reverb maybe. So it really opens up quite a lot of flexibility there. We can also have a low, mid, high version. And then we have mid and side. And then we have a general utility device. Now I think this one is going to get quite a lot of use. So it has a basic, quite a rudimentary low pass and high pass filters there. We can mono the bass with a frequency set to the right here. We can also add a bit of stereo width to it. But for me, most importantly, is a dedicated pan knob. So in the past, I used to modulate the pan on either the oscillators themselves or one of the filters. But now just put this at the end of the chain or wherever you want. And then I can do some random panning, for example. So this list here was in the main output section, but then you can also have bus 1 and bus 2, as I said earlier when I was discussing the mix tab. To the right, we have the matrix as usual. Now here we have quite a lot more sources. So looking down the list, a lot of these are familiar, but we also have additional ones such as oscillators themselves, and we have filters as mod sources. And then moving on to the right of that was the feature that I was most excited about. And that, if you're familiar with Vital, is the mod remap function. So instead of the modulation going linearly up like so, well, apart from this node that I've just added, we can now make it do things like this. Or should we wish, we can go straight up there and then drop back down to 0. This opens up an infinite amount of flexibility with the mod curves. Apart from that, we have some more destinations, but they're probably better explained when I get to those individual sections. And then the rest is basically as per V1. And then we have the global tab, and I think this is going to be one of the most powerful features, but also, if I can make a prediction, one of the most overlooked features. But let's see how that plays out. Hopefully it is adopted and embraced. So here, for each oscillator, you can add some, let's say some random panning, or you can modulate the panning like so. This is for each of the voices. So voice 8 pan, or we can do voice 7 pan. We have detune for that as well, cutoff, envelopes, then mod 1 and mod 2. We can add some randomization to the envelopes like so. And then just moving over to the right to this SERUM 1 compatibility mode. Now what I believe this is for is, as I said right at the start, this is 100% fully backwards compatible to SERUM 1. However, I believe the engine is also slightly improved. So if you want your patches to sound exactly the same, then enable S1 compatibility mode. However, if you don't mind a little bit of variation on account of the new engine, then you can happily leave that off. Then on to the oscillators themselves. As you can see, we now have a third oscillator, but even more exciting, we have a multi-sample mode. And if you're familiar with, let's say, big contact sample packs where they multi-sample a piano, so every velocity has its own sample, then essentially that's what this is. So you can set up different velocities to trigger different samples. So really a lot of flexibility. In fact, let's hear one. Let's go keys, baby grand. So as you can see here, every time I press a key, it is triggering a different sample. So every key is individually sampled. So the amount of flexibility there is, well, I'm not going to say infinite, but I'm going to say, well, you can have 128 variations, no doubt, on each oscillator. Just mind-blowing. Next, we have a separate sample engine. And in the past, for the sample engine, you probably used to use the noise oscillator and then trigger the one-shot mode, but now you can load it up in a separate oscillator. So we can have a one-shot mode, loop mode, which is forward or reverse, and then forward or reverse loop, and then tailed, I'm not quite sure, I need to investigate that one. And then moving on, we have the granular engine. So let's load up, in this one, let's go maybe a bode. A hugely welcome addition having the granular engine in here. Then below that we have spectral. And once again, it's hard to say which one's my favorite, but between spectral and granular, infinite amount of uses for those. Then we can load up here, we can load up our spectral filter and draw something in. And then below that we have the warp modes. A lot of these we've seen before, but there's also quite a few new ones. So shepherd's tone, there's phase twist, which is a new one that I'm seeing. Formant, I don't recall being in SERUM 1. So loads more to explore. But then, in addition to that, we can now add a shepherd's tone, for example. So like I said, I'm moving through this very, very quickly. Otherwise, the video would be 4 hours long. I will do separate videos on each of these functions in future. And then to the top, we have our filter mode. So we can blend between filters 1 and 2. We can also send them to bus 1 or 2. And then in the filter modes themselves, quite a few new ones, and they're listed under a separate S2 menu. And my favorites here are probably MG Dirty, MG Ladder, and obviously a diffuser. I assume WSP is WASP, so I need to investigate that one. And if it is, that is going to sound amazing. Obviously oscillator B. Oh, that has some balls to it. And then below that we have 8 macros, which is very handy. In the envelopes, we have a separate BPM button here. We could do that in version 1 by just typing in 1/16, for example, but now it's much cleaner having a separate button there for it. And then to the right of that, we have our LFOs. Now this is where a lot of the fun is going to be. So here we have a path. So now we can draw in a 2-dimensional modulation. So let's do something funky like this. We can even make it go backwards. So now the modulation, if we put this to cutoff, which is just insane, being able to draw in a modulation curve like that. It's blown my mind. That's something I never even considered. And let's put the Y on the warp mode up here, and here let's go with sync. But let's keep moving on. We have two chaos modes. So we have a Lawrence, which I just love the animation here of this. We also have Rossler. And then we have a traditional sample and hold. And this is an example of probably the most simplest addition, but also probably one of the most welcome additions. We had Chaos 1 and Chaos 2 in version 1, and they worked, but I much prefer having it dedicated here in the LFO. We now have 10 LFOs. We can't see them because, as usual, it only expands when you max out the 6. Moving on below that, we have a dedicated clip function. And essentially now we're approaching DAW territory. So now we can draw in dedicated MIDI patterns here and assign that to a clip, but then we can do another one. So now let's activate this one. So now we can trigger these via our keyboard. So as you can see on mine, I'll put a little photo up now. I have the lower octave colored green to trigger these. And then the octave above that to trigger the ARP, and this one is colored purple to match the ARP function. And once again, in version 1, we were able to create ARP patterns by using the LFO and using a stepped arrangement in the LFO to pitch. It worked absolutely fine, but now we have a dedicated and extensive ARP function. Once again, set to different keys, so we can trigger these individually and having a different pattern on each of the 12 keys. And then to the right of that, we have keyboard where we can enter a scale, we can add a bit of swing, and also we have an oscillator mapping function here. And this allows the mapping of the different oscillators to different keys. So for example, let's just do this, quite rudimentary. Well, let's put this one back. We could, for example, in oscillator A, use that as a sample engine and just have a bass or a kick or anything you want on the lower octaves. So when you press those keys, it will only trigger the kick. Then you could have a piano or any other instrument on top of that that's only triggered by the upper keys. So much flexibility. And in addition, you can change that to velocity also. So here, for example, you could have the sub and then the oscillators triggering a kick. But then as the velocity increases, so in this case, as it gets above 80 or thereabouts, then it will trigger a noise layer on top of the kick. Really cool, so much flexibility. And it's one of those features where the only limit is your imagination. And I would recommend when going through this, and to paraphrase my friend who said, right click the fuck out of everything. I think that's the key. Every function, right click and see what different options are presented to you, because there isn't as much hidden as there was in SERUM 1, but there is still so many functions that I've not even covered, because as yet I don't know that they exist. So I apologize for this video being a lot more talking than it is of sound, but in the next video there'll be some in-depth coverage of all these functions with sound examples. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you then. Bye bye.